Great, okay, and we'll get started. Hi everyone, Max here in Berlin, Germany, and I'm here today with the European Time Zone Meetup group, and we are going to discuss two poems, two rather well-known ModPo poems that are collected in the new ModPo book, The Difference is Spreading. The first one we're going to read is one of the ModPo chestnuts, an Emily Dickinson poem, The Brain is Wider Than the Sky. And we'll be discussing this poem and a little bit the reading that's offered by Ray Armentrout of this poem, which is included in the book, The Difference is Spreading. So I'll start by reading the poem and then we'll get into it. This poem, for anyone who's done any ModPo at all, this one should be familiar. Great. Emily Dickinson, The Brain is Wider Than the Sky. The brain is wider than the sky, for put them side by side, the one the other will contain with ease, and you beside. The brain is deeper than the sea, for hold them blue to blue, the one the other will absorb, as sponges buckets do. The brain is just the weight of God, for heft them pound for pound, and they will differ, if they do, as syllable from sound. So, as Ray Armentrout says right off the bat, this is a wonderfully tricky poem, as are most Emily Dickinson poems. So I am assuming that we're all familiar with this to some extent. What are first impressions today of this poem?
I hadn't read it for a while.
Yeah.
I found that the word bucket really stopped me in my tracks.
Why is that?
Because up until then, it was a kind of philosophical argument, if you like. And sponge, I kind of hardly noticed. In bucket, that's the sound of the word, it's the hardness of the word bucket. And the idea that you're going to squeeze the sponge into the bucket or whatever just seemed so unlike the rest of the poem. And so, going on from there, I was back in the philosophical mode with God and the brain and so forth. But that word bucket in the middle was shocking to me. And I don't know if anybody else had the same sort of experience. And it's some years since I'd looked at it, apart from getting the book a few months ago and just having browsed through it. So there you are, there's bucket to start us off.
That's a great place to start. And I wasn't quite stopped in my tracks, but the way that you were, but I think this is the grunginess that Ray Armentrout talks about in her reading. She says in this second stanza, it takes a sort of grungy turn where suddenly there's buckets and sponges and what we imagine to be, the work of cleaning the floors or something, which I think that's sort of what you're stumbling on, or what you're latching onto here, Jenny, is this sudden intrusion of this very very material, unglamorous object or situation in this otherwise like very philosophical poem. Anybody else trip up on buckets or have a reaction to this sudden eruption of cleaning labor, sponges and buckets in this otherwise sort of a heady poem about imagination?
To me, a bucket is very much like just your head, with a sponge as a more or less normal simile to the brain, and that your head contains the brain. So it's a hard word, but the fact that it starts with a B, and to me it fits. Yeah, it didn't really stop me.
Anyone else?
Stopped me for sure. It's also just listening to Jeroen, it's true. It's a hard word, and it's funny because coming right after sponge, so you kind of get this reinforcement of hard to soft. I won't say too much because my internet connection is a little unstable.
Oh.
Be a bit careful today.
Yeah, I agree with
But-
you. Yeah, I also stumbled across about the buckets because I mean it also is just in between those two dashes, which also kind of puts this emphasis on it. And then it is a really weird word, and I think it kind of introduces this everyday language that hasn't been like part of the poem before, because like sky and brain, like Jane said, it's a really philosophical language in a way, because it's so like these wide concepts. And then there's this bucket and sponge, and it really felt out of place when I read it for the first time. I agree.
And
I also think that it is a strange duality that comes in here. You have the sponges, then you have the dash. Maybe Dickinson rethinks whether that is the right comparison, and then she says no, it's like a bucket. She talks about absorption. The brain is deeper than the sea, and the other will absorb. And she compares that to sponge, and the sponge lets something through. So not everything, not every item is hold or included in the sponge. It flows through, and it's different with the bucket, which can really contain everything.
There's, yeah, the duality I think is an important, or duality in general is an important theme throughout this poem. And I think the remarks from Andy, Jenny, that you made about the sound of the word, I think that's actually really crucial here too. I think that Dickinson is taking some pleasure in this juxtaposition of these two very different sounding words, sponges and buckets. Like there's a sponge is such a spongy word. It's soft and it's absorptive in a weird way. And bucket is such a hard word. It's a bucket. And I think that she's really playing with that. Since this sort of like side by side hefting or weighing is sort of what the whole poem is about. And I think the grammar there is kind of odd. Was somebody about to say something?
Yeah, I was thinking, it's hard as a non-native speaker. When you think nowadays, buckets of something, loads of something, it's really a word for a lot. And I don't know if in the time of Emily Dickinson, it was a normal way of putting things like that. You know, if you can say a sponge, no, it's even bigger, it's buckets full.
Right.
I don't know if that's a 19th century expression.
I think the idea that buckets contain a lot is, yeah, I think that's present here and established.
Mm.
And it makes as you said, it's the grammar. If you compare that to the other stanzas, the structure of these stanzas, they are quite similar. And you have with ease and you beside, that's the final line in the first stanza. The third one has syllables from sound. So these ideas are grammatically connected, but it's different with the second stanza. Sponges, and then you have the dash, buckets, again a dash, do. So it's a different grammar.
Can you say more? Different grammar from the previous stanza?
I mean, it's syntactically correct, even though there are these dashes with ease and you beside. That's a complete sentence.
Right.
You have sponges, and then a new idea comes in, buckets, or is it a correction, an enhancement? No, it was the wrong word, and then she chooses a different word, buckets do.
See, I would just, okay. I think that there's two different understandings of the grammar here. Does somebody have a different understanding? Because I actually have a different understanding. I understand what you're saying, Mark. I think we can get into it because I think this is part of the what's confusing about this poem. But does somebody, Andy, do you have a different understanding of meaning here?
I did, and I was going to ask about that understanding because I was wondering, is she saying that buckets absorb sponges? But listening to Mark, I'm actually really pleased because he just pointed out that there's a different way to understand that she's correcting herself. But otherwise, yeah, my question was going to be, is she saying that buckets absorb as sponges, buckets do absorb? Was that the original?
The one the other will absorb, that refers to brain and sea. The brain absorbs the sea, and the sea also absorbs the brain. And then she compares that to sponges, and she corrects her comparison by saying, no, it's as buckets do. Buckets absorb like the brain absorbs the sea and vice versa.
But does a bucket absorb anything?
Right.
A sponge definitely absorbs things. I'll go with that.
What's
How do you really say a bucket absorbs anything?
Isn't it taking something in? Holding something?
Absorbing, is it?
Yeah. I think this is part of the confusion here, or I suppose the openness of the poem. So my understanding is the way that I've always read this is that it's let me look at the standard real quick. The brain is deeper than the sea. The one the other will absorb. The brain will absorb the sea as sponges absorb buckets. That's the way that, so the sponge is doing the absorbing of the buckets of water. So here, if you follow all of the terms, sponge is brain, bucket is sea.
I never thought of that.
Oh yeah, really?
Never thought of that.
So the one the other will absorb. Sponges will absorb buckets, brain will absorb the sea. And this is various, all of these things, one, that can absorb something else.
And then the metaphor is parallel. I see what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. It's a parallelism. Exactly. It's so Jenny, was your reading of it also that sponges and buckets are both metaphors for the brain here?
No, my reading was that the sponges were fine because they do absorb things, and the buckets were just this complete thing that kind of brings you down to earth. That people squeeze their sponges into their buckets when they're cleaning things, and what's it got to do with anything else that we've ever looked at? And that was where I got stuck. So the idea of, I'm still not quite sure about sponges absorbing buckets, but this is a different way of looking at it. So thank you.
So this is so interesting. Okay, so and I think this is like the pleasurable mystery of Emily Dickinson, right? And like the strange syntax, but also the use of dashes, which is very much open for interpretation. So we have Mark reading it as this kind of like
alternatives.
Yeah, exactly. Like
sponges or buckets.
Like a kind of a positive, like she's offering clarifying information. Jenny, you're reading it almost as this sort of flight of fancy, this almost associative. She's like the brain is like a sponge, and sponges go into buckets. These kinds of, it's almost like this sort of associative thing.
I think I'm reading it that she's pulling our legs when she gets to the buckets. But all the rest of the poem makes a lot of sense. But the buckets, she's thinking, now what can I drop in there that will just really make the whole thing not make sense after all?
Right.
That's just me. It's mischievous to me. It's mischievous.
Yeah,
I think that's really interesting.
Were you going to say something, Unia?
Oh no, I just wanted to say I read it as Mark did actually. I also thought it was like kind of like a correction or something, because I also kind of connected it to the adjective in the first line in each stanza, because it's in this line, it's the brain is deeper than the sea. And I thought, well, if it's like a comparison, well, deep and sponges doesn't really fit. So I thought, well, maybe she's rethinking what could she use as another metaphor, and then buckets fits better because it's deep. like a bucket is something that you can like use the word deep with.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a good group.
Oh, wow. That's true,
I'm-
right? Because
I'm-
then, right, the idea of depth, of course,
Yeah.
that's where the bucket comes in, because the sponge doesn't have depth in that way that she's
Yeah, a wonderfully tricky poem.
right, indeed. I think
I'm really enjoying Max's clarification because I'm also thinking, because I got stuck like you, Jenny, on the impossibility of this metaphor. How does a sponge, even if she is saying a sponge absorbs a bucket, how does it do that? And then I thought, okay, well, she's pointing out that the way the brain absorbs the sea is also impossible in a way. And then I got to wondering, is she trying to say the sponge absorbs the water in the bucket the same way the brain would absorb the sea? I don't know.
that's always been my reading of that. Yeah, that the bucket is the.
She means the water in the bucket.
Yeah. It's the information or the experience or the totality of the world or the stimuli or whatever it is that the brain is able to take in and contain. Just a sponge is like that, and a bucket is like that, but the sponge is able to absorb everything that's in the bucket.
Right.
And do the same work of the bucket. I mean, not really, but like we can understand that, like this is where she's going with this metaphor. The sponge is able to do the work of the bucket, but in a very different and more compact form. In terms of carrying water, transporting water, or holding water. And I think that sort of the syntax here, the unusual syntax for English, where the subject and the object are put together and the verb is put at the end, is I think that's very consistent with the setting up of different oppositions or kind of dual terms that's happening throughout this poem. So there's this sort of like hefting again of sponges and buckets. So she's playing with the grammar. So instead of saying the one the other will absorb as sponges absorb buckets or something, right? She's getting creative here and putting sponges and buckets side by side, the way that everything is sort of presented in a side by side way in this poem. Pound for pound, syllable sound. What do we think of Ray Armantrout, which she writes here at the very beginning? This is a wonderfully tricky poem. It consists of 3 assertions. The first is completely unproblematic, at least for people living within the Enlightenment humanist tradition. I found that so funny. This is like very, I mean, unproblematic. I don't exactly know what she means here, but I think that like what's happening in the first stanza is also not entirely clear. Like I don't see it as unproblematic. I think that it's very complicated. So maybe we can take a second to talk about this first stanza. The brain is wider than the sky, for put them side by side, the one the other will contain with ease, and you beside. And I think that Ray Armantrout is saying like, okay, this is a very familiar image of the power of the mind and the imagination to contain, the vastness of the world, right? But I don't know that it's unproblematic or that it's self-evident. I think it's actually quite tricky.
Yeah, I agree with you. I am also, when I read that she found this unproblematic, I also had to smile because I think it is unproblematic in comparison to the other stanzas, because I think it really is like the easiest to understand, maybe because it's like the most familiar image that she uses in this poem. But generally, it's so typical of Emily Dickinson to kind of use the words that you least expect, even with images that you kind of maybe are used to already, with like the brain instead of the mind, which Ray Armantrout also said in the essay that it's really unusual to use like the word brain instead of saying the mind, and also like is wider than the sky, which was something that I really kind of put my focus on when reading the poem, like the adjectives that I used, because I think the wider and then the deeper, it's just really interesting that she uses wide instead of high. To me, when I first read the poem and I first read the line, what would have come most naturally to me would have been brain as like maybe as high as the sky or maybe higher. Because I think if you compare two things and you use the word sky, I think mostly it's about height and like something is really sky high. But wider than the sky, I think really put the focus on like covering ground instead of transcending, which I found really interesting because it's something that I wouldn't like normally say if I were to compare something with the sky.
Right, there's a spatial logic that's kind of unclear. And I see what you mean about the height. Yeah, the height of the sky. I mean, the sky is wide and then it's broad, but you can't put something beside the sky, you know, like that's like you can put something in the sky, you can put something below the sky. But you can't put something next to the sky, which is totally strange.
Yes, but she needs that because of the width of the sky.
Right.
If it's only the height, then you can put anybody next to it. And if you have that wide sky, it is already the brain that has to imagine something that goes beyond what can be seen and realized. To me, wider, that's an inner rhyme or rhyme on side and beside. So probably she used that also for pathological reasons.
That's good reading of the internal rhyme there. Wider, put them side, wide, side, side.
And I agree that the poem is so easy, or the first stanza is so easy to understand. I mean, the problem occurs already with the second word, namely brain. What is meant by brain? To us, that's clear. It is the imagination. It is the power of creativity. But I don't think that's so unproblematic.
It's because I'm from Holland, but as we live in a very flat land. To us, to me, the sky is something that is wide because it's really from horizon to horizon. So that's normal, but the problem comes with line 2, because when you have something that is as wide as it gets from horizon to horizon, how can you put it side by side with something else?
You can't.
No. That's kind of problematic.
Isn't also sky a strange word for Emily Dickinson? I mean, she used the correct expression. In other poems, she talks about heaven. She refers to the sky, and here you have what it really is, namely the sky.
Well, there's the everlasting roof of the sky in Dwelling Possibility.
Which also then compares to paradise and
right, this kind of
for everlasting angles of the sky. Yeah,
I think sky is more has more to do with let's say reality, and
yes, but Emily Dickinson uses heaven in most of her poems, and she refers to sky, but also to this transcendent meaning of it when she talks about paradise.
Okay.
And yes, sky being capitalized is interesting, given that C is not capitalized. I mean, yeah, I think her capitalization and punctuation is at times maybe random, but it's this is true. Sky is an interesting choice.
But is Dickinson random? Well, you
No, I don't think that it's
random, and Isaac, is
random.
Dickinson random?
No, she isn't. Plus Sky, because also brain is capitalized, and she uses capitalization for abstracts, and she uses brain as an abstract noun, and then it is the same also with Sky. Why she doesn't do that with C, I have no idea.
Yeah,
she does it with blue.
She does it with blue.
Yeah, it's nice with when you go back to sky, and the sky is often blue.
Yes, but the capitalizations are interesting.
Mm.
Quite right, Max. No, it was not Max, it was Mark.
There's so Armin Trout's her reading here, which is pretty familiar and accurate one, is that the poem is a kind of like escalation, right? It's the brain is wider than the sky, then it's deeper than the sea, then it's the weight of God, right? So it's this, like, each stanza is kind of upping the ante on the previous one in terms of this like bold vision of the power of the imagination. But then it kind of, like, as Armin Trout rightly points out, it sort of narrows back down at the very end. What do you all make of this gradual progression to the last stanza, where we suddenly have the brain being as heavy as God, but then that being compared to syllables and sounds like this very big, massive comparison of the mind and God, and then this microscopic zooming in on the building blocks of language and meaning, the syllable.
Max, it's not a comparison. You have the brain is wider than the sky, that's a comparison. The brain is deeper, also a comparison. And then the final stanza, the brain is just
the way
it's equal. Right. It's equal. So no comparison.
That's true.
And yet there's that if they do. I'm stuck on, just like Jenny with the bucket. I was really stuck on if they do, and they will differ if they do. And it's like the whole, she's sort of like looking back at that stanza and second guessing it. I'm just really interested in how she stops there and says, if they do.
And as Armin Trout says, syllables and sounds are in fact very different things. Right. And so it's, the poem is kind of inviting this, or almost like leading us to imagine syllables and sounds as being the same, right? Because it's, she's saying, as you just said, Mark, this is a comparison now of equals, right? Like so we're supposed to understand that, like, the brain and God are the same mass. It's a microscopic difference. But in fact, the difference between syllables and sounds is great, because they're two extremely different things. The syllable is semantic, and as Armin Trout says, like, all syllables are sounds, but not all sounds are syllables. Using a very like classic, like, formal logic approach to thinking about this comparison. That's true, yeah. So in fact,
but they have a similar sound, the alliteration, syllable and sound.
Sure.
And she stresses the sound by the final word, sound.
Yeah, I also think it's really interesting that it's not clear which one is which, like which is the brain the syllable, or is God the syllable? Like, what is the metaphor of which word in the first line? Is the brain the syllable and God is the sound, or is it the other way around? Because I think even if we were to make sense of, like, is a syllable, like, what is the difference and what is to us maybe more important, even if we could make that distinction for ourselves, it wouldn't really be clear if the brain is the syllable or if it's the sound.
I think she questions the differences if they do. She isn't sure whether they are different, and they will differ a syllable from sound. If they do, she doubts that, and she also starts by saying the brain is like the weight of God.
And by saying the brain is just the weight of God, she's throwing the whole existence of God into question.
Of course.
It's really about, is it leading up to this point where does God exist at all? So she's got this question at the end, and they will differ if they do. But the question that rises from that to me is there a God, or is God the concept of the brain, if you like?
Right.
Oh, that was what I was also struggling about some seconds ago. I think no, that the brain is just the weight. She doesn't say the brain equals God. The brain equals the weight of God.
It's just right, but does God have weight? That's right, because how much does a brain weigh? Like a kilogram, right? Like,
Right. Yes.
and it's, yeah, I mean, it's interesting here. It's just okay, so Jenny,
God
you're offering
has weight.
Jenny,
in
you're
the
offering the
Christian
reading that
understanding, we are the image of God, so God must be like us.
So okay, so Mark, you're understanding just the weight as in like the brain is only, you're understanding just as this like the brain is but the weight of God. The brain is only like God has a weight, and it's like that's what the brain is.
The weight, yes. Mhm.
Right. And Jenny, I think
And the question is, what actually is weight? As you said before, can it be measured in kilograms, or what is it? Or is it also an abstract noun, not capitalized?
Maybe it's more the importance, and it has the importance, the weight, more than the kilograms.
But I do think it's interesting to think, and so if you take it very literally, and you think that the brain weighing, being this like lump of mass that's actually not that big, weighing about a kilo, like that's the weight of God, the huge thing, God is actually really just like this 1 kilogram thing. And that supports your reading, Jenny, that God is being presented here as a construct of the mind. That the mind, the brain is just this like lump of tissue, but it has this like incredible like imaginative power, and the limits of that power, that's what God is, right? It's like that's or the limits, or just the limitlessness of that power, I suppose, is what God is.
I think she's asking us that question and very carefully not coming down on either side herself.
Right, I think she is.
I think that first line is raising that question for us. And Mark's saying that the question is the weight. I'm saying the question is the difference between God and the brain.
Right. What is the difference between God and the brain? Right.
What's the difference between God and the brain? That they might weigh the same, but weight isn't necessarily, in a poem, we're not necessarily restricted to the words in the poem. We're our imaginations are set loose by the way the words are put together.
Well, we have Stanley joining. I guess Stanley's tuning in a little later here. Sorry, Jenny, I didn't. I just saw him popping up here. Well, we'll give him a second to come in, and he'll be here for the second, Paul, when we get around to it. But I think you're right, Jenny, that she's being cautious she's being very enlightenment about it, which is again what Ray Armantrout offers in her reading, that this is, you know, she's not out saying that God is it's just this like human concept, but she's trying to really humanize God and have this very humanistic idea about theology.
She's planting it.
Right. And I think hi Stanley, can you hear us?
Stanley.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Welcome. We're just talking about Ray or Emily Dickinson's "The Brain is Wider Than the Sky."
Did you start early?
We start. Are we on different times? We started 45 minutes ago.
Oh, I thought Berlin time was 8 o'clock. I thought it was 15 minutes early. Oh,
No. We're already well on our way. I think that happens.
my mistake. I was out shoveling rocks with Risha, you know.
I missed the whole thing one week for the same reason.
But I had it down as 8 o'clock Mountain Time. 7 o'clock Mountain Time. All right.
3 o'clock Central European summertime.
Okay.
So
anyway, if you're 45 minutes in, sorry I'm late, guys.
No worries.
Everybody, I'm just looking at everybody's faces. Everybody's smiling. You're still talking about Emily Dickinson.
We're deep in this reading here of "The Brain is Wider Than the Sky," and now we're talking about the very last stanza, and I do want us to zoom in on the last 2 lines, since I think this is the big provocation. Like the brain and God, when you heft them, pound for pound will differ if they do a syllable from sound. This is the huge provocation of this poem ultimately. That it's not just this idea that God is a sort of a human creation, but it's also this idea that if they differ will be the way that a syllable and a sound differ. And I think that's sort of what Ray Armantrout is seizing on here. So I think maybe we could just get a couple, I don't know, get I think we've already started to talk about this a little bit. Maybe we can kind of gather our reactions again to this moment. Because I'm actually quite convinced by Ray Armantrout's reading that in fact, all syllables are sounds, but not all sounds are syllables. And so if we think about that logically, then we actually have the category of sound containing the category of syllable. So we're back to the sponges and the buckets, or the brain holding the sea, or the brain being wider and able to contain all of the sky. We suddenly have the category of sound, which I think is God, now holding the brain. And I don't know that this is what Emily Dickinson intends for in this poem, but this is in fact what we're getting when we stop and we think about it. I don't know. Did anybody else have like really want to talk about their struggles with trying to actually understand what she means here at the end? Because I think that this hefting, this comparison thing is starting to break down at the end, especially in these last 2 lines.
Well, as Junia said earlier, it's completely unclear which one is the syllable and which one is the sound. And next to that, the problem, of course, is that a syllable is maybe a sound with meaning. So it's somewhere higher somehow. And on the other hand, sound is a bigger container than syllables, because not all sounds are syllables. So it's completely unclear to me which one, if we knew which way around she meant it, which one is bigger or more interesting or higher than the other one. So it's a complete breakdown.
To me, the final line, and even the final stanza is unproblematic. Syllables have something to do with sound. It's the written word, but it's the brain that creates sound. I have no idea how you read text, but when I read the text, I do not read letters, I read sounds. The text is transformed into something, into sounds, and that is what gives meaning to me. So the brain is really like God. It's creative, that the brain creates something. I read the text, I read syllables, but in fact, the brain creates sounds, and I hear a text. I do not really read the text, I hear the text with my inner voice.
When you read a language that you can, and there are languages that you can only read and you can't speak them. When I hear English people reading a Latin text, it sounds completely different than when I, in grammar school, as a Dutch person, read Latin. So I'm not really sure if you go really via sound when you read something in your mind.
Yeah, the example of Latin is interesting for sure. Greek or various dead languages where we don't actually really know what it's supposed to sound like.
Yeah.
But do you read letters, or do you create sounds with your brain when reading?
It really depends, I guess. When I read poetry, I try to make it really sound like something in my head. But when I read, I studied physics, so I've read a lot of physics and equations. And I read them as easily as text, but they don't make sounds.
Right.
The physics don't make sounds?
An equation in physics doesn't make sound. No.
Right. Of course, it doesn't make sound. Yeah.
E equals mc squared. I don't hear that when I see it.
Sure. That's interesting. That's right. Yeah.
Yes, but usually when I read text, it's my inner voice that reads the text to me. I see the letters, but there's the inner voice that talks and tells the story.
Surely, when it's let's say art, poetry, and novels, I try to really hear them. And in those cases, I completely agree. Yeah.
And so you actually put the novel on stage. I mean, you act it out.
Right.
So it can be very strange when you see a movie and they all sound wrong.
And Andy, you've posted a good point here in the chat. Words make images before sounds. That's kind of interesting. That this sort of like this evocative quality that precedes the sound. I think that's totally true. I think that. Wait, so this conversation is sort of calling into bringing into focus the idea that syllable has this sort of semantic or that there's this quality of meaning that's in syllable that's not necessarily in sound, which is another important distinction, right? Because sounds don't have meanings necessarily, right? But a syllable, because of its linguistic association, tends to have, it tends to, I mean, it's the building block of meaning, syllable. They may not have meaning on its own. Well, actually, a lot of them do have meaning on their own.
Okay, my thing is mantras, and I do Sanskrit mantras, and I've learned there's a kind of notation. It's called sargam, which is the do re mi fa so of Sanskrit, and it's sargam. And if I take a mantra and break it down and just play the keys on the harmonium, get that sound, and then sing the sargam along with it, I learn the mantra a whole lot faster than if I was trying to learn the mantra. Like I learned the melody and I learned the, so when a syllable from sound, I mean, I think I read this 10 times this week, you know, just try to see what I really felt. And so sound is frequency. And interesting, the physics, when you said you studied a lot of physics and you don't get the sound when you read them, but you get the screen, you know, you see it. Well, when I do mantras, I get the sound, I get the syllables, and it resonates through all my chakras. And anyway, but that's why I do it, because it's exciting, you know, it's uplifting for me, and it's my meditation. But I would like to explore more the looking at physics and reading physics texts, seeing the sounds of it, because that's kind of exciting to me. I'm not into, yeah, E equals MC squared is hard for me to visualize. You know? Anyway.
Should we maybe get ready to move on to the next poem, and we can, does anybody have any concluding thoughts to offer on this poem, or perhaps something you want to pull out from Ray Armantrout's reading of it that you found particularly interesting or useful?
I think what I found really great about the poem is that it ends with words. I mean, like syllable and sound, it all brings it back to the poem itself, and like just generally words. And you are reminded that Emily Dickinson is a poet, and she loves to bring that into her poetry as well. I mean, it's not really meta-poetic, but I think if you really want to put it into the poem, that's where you would find it.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. It comes back to language at this point, at this concluding couplet.
I don't know if you mentioned this at the beginning, but I like Ray Armantrout's opening statement. This is a wonderfully tricky poem.
we did talk about that.
Ambiguous poem.
Yeah, it's really a wonderfully tricky poem. And I'm in a group on Tuesdays that it's like old guys that like poetry, you know. And one guy read a poem, you know, hey, why do we read these poems? Well, if we didn't read these poems, nobody would listen. And if nobody listened, you know, why would you create it in the first place? I mean, it was a really good poem that I read. So one of the reasons that we're here is to look at poetry and get excited by the words and the syllables and the sounds, and wherever they resonate in you is good. Okay, that's my take.
And then that also.
I'm sorry I was late. I really.
Oh no, it's okay.
I thought I was 15 minutes early. You know.
Right. That also sort of what both of you were saying here, Gunia and Stanley, are that sort of bolsters this, or reminds us of the pleasure that Emily Dickinson is also taking in the writing of this. It kind of goes back to what we were saying about the sounds of sponge and buckets. You know, this sort of play with sound that appears to be taking place. Right. That this is ultimately like she's having fun doing this. That poetry is this sort of the art of syllables and sound. While also perhaps being a place to, you know, within the confines of the ballad form, the demands of meter and rhyme, it's a chance to play with syntax and grammar such that you can kind of start, I'll say play again, you can play around with these categories in such a way that it becomes wonderfully tricky, right? That like, you know, all these categories that we're struggling to kind of keep straight, sponges, buckets. We had that whole conversation about what's absorbing what. This idea that the brain and God are, one is a syllable, one is a sound, but we don't know what. There's all this ambiguity that's created in the course of writing this ballad form poem, because she has to, like, in order to make to meet the metrical and rhyme demands, she's moving words around, and kind of asking us to try to keep up. It's sort of neat, and I think that for all of the for ModPo's celebration of free verse and open forms, I think it's always that this is why Emily Dickinson is so great, is because she's using, I mean, all of her poems follow this very strict, not all of them, but like most of them follow this very strict ballad form, and yet, like, she's using that form to create ambiguity, right? Like, it's kind of neat, and I think that's why she's like a frequent, or she's the godmother of the ModPo syllabus, right? So
I got to grips with her at all in ModPo. I just kind of let that whole section of ModPo float past me. So what I want to say is, rather than anything in particular about this poem, thank you to Ray Armand-Trout and to this group for getting me really interested in this poem. So thank you all very much.
oh, well,
My apologies that I'm going to have to go, but that's probably about all the energy I've got.
that's fair enough. Thanks.
I'll look and see what you've all said on the recording.
I'll be sure to send it around. Thanks for tuning in, Jenny, and
I really enjoy those. Thank you.
Of course, yeah, no, that Emily Dickinson is always fun to read, as a group, for all the obvious reasons we just pulled out. So should we move on then to a very, very different poem, Gertrude Stein's Carafe, Blind Glass. Ciao, Jenny. All right, yeah, let's move on to Stein's Carafe. That is a blind glass, very, very different from Dickinson, but it's the next one in the book, and it's also a kind of ModPo, like, urtext, a sort of, I mean, heck, gave the title to the book, right? So it's clearly like it's a pretty big deal. All right, Gertrude Stein's A Carafe That Is a Blind Glass. A kind in glass and a cousin, a spectacle and nothing strange, a single hurt color and an arrangement in a system to pointing. All this in not ordinary, not unordered in not resembling. The difference is spreading. All right, I'm gonna read that one more time. A kind in glass and a cousin, a spectacle and nothing strange, a single hurt color and an arrangement in a system to pointing. All this in not ordinary, not unordered and not resembling. The difference is spreading.
Mm.
Yeah. I mean, this one's never easy. And I think that ModPo, in ModPo, like in the syllabus, we've sort of offered the definitive reading of this poem. But as Ron Silliman suggests in this quick gloss of the poem, like, this poem is sort of, it's resisting it's resisting a definitive reading. It's resisting reading to some extent, which is what makes it so compelling. And also, as Silliman offers in his kind of historical contextualizing of this poem, it's what makes it so different from other modernist poems, especially the high modernist or poems or other high modernist literature of Pound and Joyce. Stein is doing something that's actually quite different from what they're doing and demands a different kind of reading. But what was everybody's first reactions or thoughts this time around on this chestnut?
Well, when I think when I read them side by side, both poems that we just trying to discuss, well, with the Dickinson poem, when I read it for the first time, I think that's one where I just didn't really need that much help to understand it at first, because I think, I mean, it has meaning, and it's, I mean, you really have to do the work to get the meaning. But I mean, I can see it on the horizon, whereas when I read this one, I really needed the essay to kind of get a grasp at what she's trying to say at all, because I didn't understand a thing before I read the essay. And so I kind of really had to do the work with this one even more than with Dickinson's.
Sure, it demands, it demands work. Which is why I think ModPo, it's so celebrated in ModPo. Anybody else?
You asked us about our first reaction when we read the poem. My reaction was, oh my God, what's that? Difficult to understand. I had problems really understanding what the poem is about, but I also thought, what a wonderful audacity. The sounds of the words, they are so great. For example, those nods, and then it's also included in unordered, where you also have the no in it, the many negations that are, going on, and that she uses.
That's interesting, the no in unordered, not unordered. So ordered, all this and not ordered.
Also these rhymes, resembling, spreading, pointing. I mean, okay, ing forms, they rhyme. But then there's also nothing. And then you actually have also the content of it. It's a problem of pointing, of connecting.
Yeah, the
Pointing, rhyming on nothing.
Oh, Mary's joining us. Hold on, sorry, I just got a notification. It's well, she'll tune in a second. I think the right, so the basic concept of Tender Buttons and of this poem is that she's describing an object, right? Like, so we're supposed to understand that she's describing a carafe here, and like with all the tender buttons, it's an exercise in description that is like not referential. Like, it's not like in describing this carafe, she's like, oh, it has curves and is a container, you know, like she's not using the obvious referential language. She's instead like coming up with an entirely new vocabulary for description, and in the process, it's also it becomes a kind of meta theorizing of language itself. Hi, Mary, can you hear us?
We got here at least a little bit. Okay, go.
Great. No, we're just talking about a carafe that is a blind glass, the Gertrude Stein poem. We wrapped up with the Emily Dickinson poem a few minutes ago. So now we're
Yeah. In the future, you'll have it, no?
Sorry?
In the future, you'll show it again. I mean,
oh yeah. The video, yeah. So yeah, no, we're talking about carafe that is blind glass. Yeah, any other, so lots of difficulty, lots of confusion. Any other reactions to?
Well, I kind of really got stuck on the first sentence, you know. I mean, the first statement, a kind to glass and a cousin. Now, what the heck does that mean? A kind to glass and a cousin.
Kind in glass and a cousin. A cousin of what? A cousin to So carafe that is a blind glass. So she's talking about like a mirror, so or something, a blind glass, some kind of like. I actually don't know what she means. But I imagine that that's what the carafe is a cousin to this blind glass. A spectacle and nothing strange, a single hurt color and an arrangement and a system to pointing, a kind and glass and a cousin.
And then what's the relation between the title and the text itself? The carafe doesn't come up again in the poem. Is it about the carafe? Us who make the connection and we say that the text is about the carafe?
I think that's how we're supposed to understand it. That the text is a description of the carafe, that this carafe is a single hurt color.
Yes, but where does she refer back to the title? She doesn't use on the expression or the term carafe anymore.
Right, of course.
Why not starting the first sentence with a carafe is a kind in glass, etc.
Right. Yeah, because I think that would undo this project of like of radical non-referentiality.
So it's us who make the connection, and it is like a dictionary. And also in dictionaries, you do not use the expression again, and it is clear that it refers to that. But actually, we make this connection and many other connections.
And exactly, yeah. And she's I actually think the dictionary is a good comparison, right? Because you don't describe a word with itself. So here she's like, okay, this is what I'm gonna try to describe, and I can't use it's like playing taboo or something. It's like I can't use this word anymore. Now I have to like I can't describe a carafe by saying it's a carafe. That doesn't make any sense, right? Well, I mean, it makes perfect sense for us because we all know what that means already, right? That's what's super tricky about the tender buttons, is that it's really forcing you to think about how how languaged our concepts of the world are, right? Like, because to describe something with itself is something we do all of the time, because the association of the objects in the world with the word for them is so strong that you know, like if you're like, oh yeah, I got this new carafe, and they're like, oh yeah, what's it like? It's like, oh, it's a carafe. And I'm like, oh yeah, actually, I totally understand what you mean, right? Like it's like you can just kind of say, you can just describe something with something, and people suddenly know what you mean. Totally weird process, but that's exactly what she's trying to get away from, I think, right? By creating some dictionary entry like poem that's like, okay, what's a carafe? How do you describe a carafe if you can't use the word carafe? And all of the other like sort of givens that we would default to. And this is what you comes up with.
Something like addiction. Go ahead, Mary.
No, it's just a blind glass, for example, a blind glass would be something that doesn't reflect. For example, a glass on a table of wine, it reflects. If you're a painter, you paint the transparency, but it reflects. And a mirror is obviously always reflecting. So it's very strange that she would say a blind glass, because glass often reflects. Okay, that's it.
I have this idea that it's kind of an impaired glass, something that you can't use because you can't drink out of it. So it's a cousin.
Right.
It's like a glass you drink out of, but it's not really that. So that's the way I read it.
Andy, did you have something to tell something?
I wanted to jump in on the dictionary analogy to say it's also like a project of portraits, like what she did with Picasso.
Right.
So she's making portraits of everyday objects, but with paint. So you don't make a portrait of something with skin. If it's a human being, you don't make a portrait of a human with skin and hair. You make it with paint.
Oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's a really good point. Sure. Yeah, because it's representational. It's you're working in a different medium in order to sort of recreate something. To
So she's
represent.
using totally different words to describe. So she's kind of like it almost feels like she's saying, let's change the medium, let's change the texture
Right.
of what I'm describing.
And yeah, and so she's playing in this the sort of medium of language and trying to shake off its referentiality. And so yeah, it becomes tricky because we want to understand the words and the choice of words here in some symbolic way. Like we're talking about the blind glass, right? Like that's such a powerful image, and it seems to be the key to the mystery of the poem in a way. But at the same time, the minute we start trying to understand that, we're actually doing the wrong thing, and we're going down the wrong way, because the whole point is that this is supposed to be like language as a medium. It's not language as a referential tool. It's not language as a system of pointing, but it's language as something else. And yet, the minute we start going even for that meta reading of being like oh, system of pointing, then like we're doing the wrong. We're doing what Gertrude Stein wants us to not do. It's a bit of a trap. Like I don't actually think that you can get. I think that Gertrude Stein means to in a way.
And it's not with a grammatical problem. What is it? A graph that is a blind glass. That is a blind glass. Is that a restriction, a relative clause? Is it a definition? A graph is a blind glass.
Right. It's not clear whether that's restrictive. Right. Is it
probably the comma identifies what it really is, but can a comma be neglected?
Look, if you have a carafe that is a blind glass, something that it has something in it, it reflects less. If it has wine in it, it reflects less. If it has water, it reflects more. So blind, maybe because it's filled with wine.
Or one of the things
right.
that Ron uses as an example is the carafe could be filled with milk, and in that case, there's no reflection.
A French person would die over that.
Yeah, but I think that this title that Mark that you've called our attention to again is in fact like, yeah, is it a carafe, which is to say blind glass, or is it this carafe, this one happens to be a blind glass? Or yeah, I don't know.
But then there's a famous artist who blows glass, Jihuli, from Seattle, Washington, and he makes plenty of carafe with blind glass because he colors the glass. See through it and nor does it reflect.
But I guess even like a transparent, yeah. I guess, yeah. So blind.
He puts color, like enamel color, not just pigment in
Right.
And you can't see through it, and it doesn't reflect.
Because the blindness of glass can refer to its opacity or to its failure to reflect, right? So like a mirror that's gone blind is one that's no longer reflective. But it's not opaque. Well, I guess it is. I don't actually know. An arrangement in a system to pointing. So this is like the meta moment that we're, I think that we will all very readily seize on in ModPo, and that Silliman seizes on again here, because it's like it's unavoidable. I mean, an arrangement in a system to pointing, like this seems to be, kind of like blind glass. This seems to be like a sort of key moment here in terms of understanding what's going on, and that is, you know, the system to pointing is exactly this sort of referential thing is exactly what seems to be in contention in the poem, or at least in Stein's approach to language. I don't know. Did anybody like understand the system to pointing perhaps in a less, or I mean, what does it even mean? Like, can somebody describe it?
But go back to.
System to pointing, or what are you referring to, Max?
Yeah.
System to pointing. Mary, were you?
No, but hard color. I got stuck on hard
color, yeah.
Because an arrangement and a system of pointing would be any language. Dog points to dog, but hard color, what does it point to?
A single hurt color and an arrangement in a system to pointing. But what is, so yeah, I'm wondering, I guess we can do that whole sentence there, a hurt color and arrangement, a system to pointing. Like, what are these describing with the Carafe? Like, we have the like higher order reading, but like, if we understand this as being a description of an object, then like, what is she describing here?
System to pointing is certainly a system of references, having references, referring to something, making connections. That is what she probably has in mind.
Yeah, but what is that like if just in terms of what she's describing though, like what does a Carafe have to do with references in language and stuff? Like if she's like, okay, I'm going to describe this Carafe and it kind of looks like an arrangement in a system to pointing, what does she mean by that? Like, is she talking about the shape? Is she talking about some quality of the object of a Carafe? Like, is she talking about, like the hurt color seems to be directly referring to the Carafe. What a hurt color is, I don't know. And
I think it's maybe it's the reminds me of the color of a bruise, which is a kind of a red wine.
yeah, that's actually, I think that's a good way to go with it. Yeah. Perhaps it's actually not all that mysterious. Perhaps when she says hurt color, she means like the color of blood or a bruise, and she means red wine.
Good.
But the arrangement in a system to pointing, I mean, so I kind of think of like the shape of the Carafe, or perhaps like the spout or something like that. There's this kind of like, it kind of comes to a point at one point in order for you to be able to like
right. Okay.
wine, right? Like but it's not a point. It's an arrangement in the system to pointing. It's sort of approaching a kind of point, a sort of vanishing point without ever actually becoming a point. And perhaps she's describing there the shape. So
and it has to be open so that something can be put out.
Right, exactly. So we've already covered the bases here. Like there's the material of it, glass, right? A spectacle and nothing strange. Man, I don't know what that means. Single hurt color, we started to go with we're talking about perhaps the color of the wine, and now an arrangement to a system of pointing. Now we're getting the shape of the thing.
Going to your arrangement, she hung around, or rather they hung around her, plenty of artists, and they're always arranging.
That's true. Yeah. Right. And I think that this is why the sort of meta reading, especially of this line, it seems so unavoidable, right? Because of the arrangement system, she seems to be referring to, there's plenty of like other creative practices that seem to be kind of bubbling up here.
You
mean like a still life?
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to say.
Yeah.
Part of a still life.
Yeah, it's exactly like a still life for sure. It's a Carafe on a table or something, and you can actually start to imagine it.
I also see it like,
and to her, it is a spectacle, something special, an event that she observes.
Stanley, did you?
Well, I
agree
was
with
gonna,
what
I
you
was gonna
mentioned?
say, I see it like a mechanical drawing vanishing point off to the, you know, the system pointing off to the vanishing point. And I don't know how that single hurt color. I'm kind of stuck on that one too.
Right.
When you think of Cubist painting, they have multiple vanishing points. So a system to pointing that might refer to a Cubist still life then.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, the multiple vanishing points, the multiple perspectival. Yeah. All this, yeah, the spectacle is interesting, Mark, that you called our attention to. This a spectacle and nothing strange, which seems almost to describe a kind of still life, right? A kind of
I also, go ahead.
It's also a kind of a visual pun with blind and glass.
right, of course, the spectacle.
Glasses, spectacles, yes.
Glasses, yeah.
I was thinking, going back to what Mary said about Chihuly and blowing the glass, making the carafes that you can't really see through, and his whole museum is things that you can't really see through, you know. I like the multiple vanishing points from the Cubism. That really, I don't know if Gertrude Stein was into that, but that is a system of pointing, and it could be pointing at all kinds of arcs of vanishing points.
And then when she says, what you go back to Stanley, not unordered, which really means ordered. Not unordered equals ordered.
Double negative.
See? So it's on purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And then what Stanley said, in not resembling, the Cubism doesn't resemble anything that came before, actually.
Right.
Good boy.
Not unordered and not resembling. All this and not ordinary. Huh. Not unordered and not resembling. And not ordinary.
But it is the title of the book. The difference is spreading.
Yeah.
We do need to know that is very important in this.
So much like the system of pointing, I mean, what does the difference is spreading? What is that? If we imagine this as a painting, what is the visual? What is the image? And the difference is spreading. What is she talking about there? I mean, we can go with like the sort of meta-poetic reading that in some ways is actually way more available here than the surface level reading. But if we were to try to do the surface level reading, like the difference is spreading. So it's like, okay, Gertrude, like, you know, tell me what you see, like what's in your living room. And she's like, there's a carafe. I'm like, okay, cool. What does it look like? And she says, you know, the difference is spreading. So what is she talking about when she says that? Is she talking about the shape of it again? Is she talking about something else? Like, what could it possibly be?
Well, I read it like the shape, like the difference, maybe like the form, like you said, maybe, but well, that would contradict the first reading with the arrangement and the system to pointing when you said maybe it points,
right?
Which I found really cool because I didn't understand the sentence before. But if we read the difference of spreading as like a glass that opens at the top, then that would like both work.
I think that actually does fit with the system, the pointing system, because there's a, you know, perhaps it's a shape like that, you know, like it's sort of, it comes to, it starts to come towards a sort of asymptote, and then it opens back up again, and yeah,
with a little beak on one side. Yeah.
as the top of, right, exactly, yeah, with a little spout, yeah.
Yeah.
I can kind of see that as the top of the carafe, this sort of spreading.
And what is the difference that is spreading?
See, I think in a really surface level way, she's not saying that the difference, the capital D difference, is a thing that is spreading. I think she's saying that, like, oh, the difference between this object and other objects is the spreading. So she's saying, like, this is like, oh, there's a whole, you know, there's a carafe here, and next to it's like a glass, and next to it is like, I don't know, a bottle of wine or something. And she's like, oh yeah, it's not unordinary, but it's still kind of cool. It's a little bit different. And what's different from what's really setting it apart is that it spreads. It's just spreading at the top. That's what, you know, she's almost having this like really like kind of like trippy encounter with like everyday objects, where she's like, you know, if you were just to really stare at something to the point that it became completely defamiliarized, you'd be like, oh wow, it's kind of cool that the thing spreads out at the top, you know. That's sort of what makes it different from everything else. And it's true, because you know, nothing else is, you don't really have that many objects that do that, right? Like maybe a vase or something, but you know, but it's like, oh, this is what makes this object this object. That's what the difference is the spreading. It's not unordinary.
Could you repeat that?
Oh, this is, in a way that she's saying that this is what makes the carafe or the vase or whatever, this is what makes this object unique, is this sort of spreading out thing that it does at the top. And it might be as simple as that. That's what she's trying to communicate, is like this, you know, having thought really hard, you know, sitting in her apartment and like communed with the carafe. She's come back with this crazy, like, this realization that, like, oh yeah, this object is actually, like, it's super ordinary, but it's really cool because it does its own thing that no other object does.
And it kind of loops back to why she was trying at the beginning to say a kind of glass, a cousin. And so she's trying to, so at the end, you kind of see that she's saying, this is how it's a cousin, this is how it's a kind.
Right.
Because it's spreading.
It's a cousin, it has its own character while being similar to its cousin objects.
Of course, when you, as we just spoke about this as a kind of a cubist painting, then you could see the difference between reality and the paintings they made is getting bigger, because we really, at that 1914, the difference between realism and the cubists started growing.
Right. So that's the sort of like the kind of like ars poetica or sort of like programmatic reading.
Yeah.
That she's saying, she's saying something about like regimes of representation here.
Yeah.
We're
done with going with the exact thing, because you can look at it yourself. So we take a different approach.
And that's,
direction.
I mean, that's exactly like what something like Cubism,
you
know, does, and you know, so much art, we don't think of it in the same way, but so much art offers its own theory of what it's doing in the work. And so like Cubism, by having the multiple vanishing points that we were talking about earlier, this multi-perspectival thing, it's you know, but it's not just saying like, oh, you know, wouldn't it be crazy if you had two vanishing points or something? It's actually offering this whole theory that like there are multiple ways of seeing things, right? And so it's sort of standing apart from you know, more traditional ways of representation, while also like playing with the idea that there's different kinds of representations happening, and that's sort of what this poem is doing too. So while I said that there's, you know, it's maybe it's like we're falling into the trap that Stein sets when we start doing a symbolic reading or even a meta poetic reading, but at the same time, it kind of makes sense that this poem should offer its own theory of what it's doing in the process of doing it. Because that's what lots of art does, especially modern art. And it's saying that like, oh yeah, the difference, you know, the difference between this object and others is this spreading thing, but also like difference is spreading. It's making me realize that like, you know, there's different ways of representing objects, everyday objects.
What if we go back to the difference between syllable and sound? That right there.
Right. Okay. What would you? Where are you taking this, Stanley?
Well, I just, the difference is spreading. I wanted to get a picture of it, and I saw, oh, I just went back to the difference of syllable and sound, and that is spreading in my mind, because the frequency itself is not the syllables. The frequency is the sound to me. So, but and the difference of those, the further away I get from my head, the more the spreading takes place. Anyway.
Maybe we have to change perspectives. What do you see when you look down on a carafe? Doesn't it look like a circle? Like an O?
Or you look,
I'm looking at the poem. What I think is so amazing about the carafe is the audacity and the many O's that she has in there. Maybe these O's represent carafes. What do you think?
Oh yeah,
it's a letter that looks like a circle.
Yeah.
And when you look down on a carafe, you have also the circle.
Multiple circles, because it'd be looking like this.
Yeah, because you would see the top and the and it would get down to the.
Good idea.
And here you have these different O's with different pronunciations. Cousin, there you pronounce the O more like an A. Not ordinary. Pointing. All variations of O's.
Yeah, I hadn't actually thought about all of the O's in this poem. And
there are so many O's in the poem.
Yeah, there are tons. Yeah, now that you mention it. Yeah, like
especially with not resembling. It is, those are a lot of concentric rings.
Right. And I think that whole like not unordered, all the negation that you called our attention to at the beginning, Mark, is like it's, you know, that's just really trying to figure out like what makes this object, you know, like what it makes it not like this, not like it's an interesting process. Does anybody want to offer some concluding thoughts on this poem before we wrap it up?
The first time I read it, I thought the difference is spreading was another way of saying that my brain or mind, how we want to say today, was exploding. It was so difficult.
It's and that actually ties nicely back to the Emily Dickinson poem. right, that there's this vast, like this like really heady vastness, right, that we're encountering here.
Try to wrap your head around a poem like this.
Right.
Yeah, same for me. And I think it's good that we kind of stayed very much like on the first level of this poem, like trying to really find the imagery that she was trying to express, like really looking for the carafe in the poem instead of jumping to the like more meta-poetic thing and the like analysis of like the differences spreading, that we can say like the meaning between like the meaning and words, that the difference between them is spreading. I think because that was the kind of interpretation that I jumped to, because it felt very familiar when reading the poem, because that was kind of the thing I understood first. But I think it's good that we kind of try to stay in the the picture that she's trying to paint in a way.
I think that's what's very hard about this poem is to give an account of what is happening, to do the surface level reading rather than to jump to the metapoetic reading. I think that's the challenge. And I also sometimes suspect that Gertrude Stein would be displeased with the metapoetic reading that we so quickly offer. I think that she would actually be like, no, I'm describing a carafe. Like that is literally what I'm doing. I'm not like, yeah, I'm not like doing this crazy like metapoetic stuff. That's crazy. I don't, I actually think that that's what she would have thought. Any other concluding thoughts on this?
One of the things I was thinking about the Industrial Revolution,
Yeah.
all kinds of products that were supposed to be exactly measured and equal. It's happening here, she's saying, but it isn't. Everything isn't equal, and it depends on how you look at it and which circumstances and how it's arranged.
Oh, that's so fascinating. So thinking of like the sort of detectable irregularities in a glass object that's might be blown or even perhaps produced, you know, by a glass blower, like by hand, and thinking about that versus the standardization of mass-produced objects, which is the theme, of course, of the long dress poem. That is all that we talk about elsewhere in ModPo. Oh, yeah, that's very fascinating, Mary, doing the kind of historical reading there, which I think is very available because it's Tender Buttons is all about like talking about objects and in some ways thinking of their origins, I guess. Yeah. So that kind of shines a light on the negation throughout. Any other final word on this? Well, thanks everyone. This was fun as always. I'm gonna stop the video. How do I do that? Oh yeah.